Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at how news from the world impacts Taiwan. I'm Louise Watt. The Pacific was a theatre of conflict as recently as World War II, and now experts are wary that a repeat of history may be underway. China has been expanding its influence in the Pacific with defence pacts and infrastructure deals. That's a concern for Australia, which considers the region its backyard. The country has held increased military drills with the US, which also has a vested interest in the region. But before we get to the global implications, let's zoom in on China's ambitions in the region. To discuss this, today we're joined by Mihai Sora, a former Australian diplomat who's now a research fellow at the Pacific Islands program at the Lowy Institute. Mihai, welcome to the show.
Hi Louise, a real pleasure to speak with you.
So to start us off, why is the Pacific so important to China?
China is after a few things in the Pacific. Number one, it's looking to expand its global influence, and the Pacific is geostrategically important in the contest for strategic primacy between China and the US. It's relatively uncharted waters for China in the strategic space. So the geography is very, very important. Globally, of course, China is also seeking to secure access for itself to resources that are vital for its own economy and development. And the Pacific, across the various nations, is host to a wealth of very important resources, minerals, gas, food stocks, forestry, and so on. And in addition, diplomatically, the Pacific is a valuable component of China's push into the multilateral space. So securing support from individual Pacific countries, and when they act as a bloc in particular in forums like the UN, can be very helpful for China on sensitive issues like human rights, for example, and law enforcement, and so on.
And on that diplomatic point, 4 of Taiwan's remaining 13 allies, so almost a third, are in this region, are in the Pacific. They are the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu. Are they in any way hindering China's campaign for influence?
Absolutely. So in 2019, we saw the switch of diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in 2 Pacific countries. That was Solomon Islands and Kiribati. There are now 4 left in the region, as you say. Now, this very much complicates China's regional engagement with Pacific countries because it has a policy of only engaging with those countries that recognize China over Taiwan. And for that reason, China is looking to establish its own regional meetings to undermine the existing regional architecture. But more importantly, it's also drilling down on its bilateral engagement, so targeting those countries where it has traction.
Even beyond Taiwan's allies, China's campaign to expand its influence in the Pacific has run into some obstacles. Mihai, stay with us. I just want to take a moment to look at how China is building eye-catching infrastructure. Last month, I traveled to Fiji to take a look for myself at what was slated to be the tallest building in the South Pacific. Here's what I saw. The WG Friendship Plaza is an unfinished shell. Years behind schedule, authorities have ordered work stopped multiple times amid concerns over construction standards and other issues. And it's not China's only development in this region. China has been expanding its influence in the Pacific for more than a decade, and that was most obvious here in Fiji, where they built large infrastructure projects like this bridge in downtown Suva. But China's influence now is on a less sturdy footing. At the end of 2022, a democratically elected government defeated a 16-year autocracy and began rebalancing Fiji's diplomatic relationships in favour of those who share its values. The country has now signed a defence agreement with New Zealand and signalled it could ditch a police exchange agreement with China.
If our values and our systems differ, what cooperation can we get from them? We need to look at that again.
Mihai, as we saw there, Fiji is starting to distance itself from China. Is this a trend in the region?
Fiji is a great example of a country that's looking to compartmentalize its security relationships with traditional partners like Australia, New Zealand, and the US, but also very much wanting to maintain those economic ties with China. Overall, China is the main customer for resources in the Pacific, so it's a very important trading partner for Pacific countries. When it comes to geopolitical jostling, because that brings them vital incomes for their national development. So it is getting more complicated for Pacific countries and their policy of friends to all, enemies to none. But what we are seeing is that some are coming down a bit more clearly in differentiating that they want to retain strategic cooperation with traditional partners. Others, of course, leaning in the other direction. Solomon Islands would be the best counterpoint to that. So it's not a trend so much as a delineation that a lot of countries are looking to articulate.
And you mentioned the Solomon Islands there, and they caused a lot of attention when they signed a security pact with China and also subsequently a police cooperation deal. I mean, how significant are these agreements with China?
Yeah, look, Solomon Islands Security Pact and its policing agreement with China is very significant for that country in particular. Solomon Islands has decades-long police cooperation programs in place with Australia and with New Zealand. Overall, the regional norm is for a region-first approach to any security incidents, whether it's internal domestic trouble or response to natural disasters. So it threatens to upend the regional balance of power. It inserts China into a security role in the Pacific, which is very, very new. And again, it runs counter to the grain of regional norms and established practices.
And everything that you said just then is really worrying Australia and the US. And let's zoom out now and look at how those two countries are turning their attention back to the Pacific. Here's what President Biden told Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese when he visited Washington in late October.
A great deal of the history of our world will be written in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years. Australia and the United States must write that story together. We must continue to advance freedom, security, and prosperity for all.
US officials say the two countries are investing in Pacific nations. The goal is to improve ties so that they'll be able to help in the event of a conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea. Mihai, how important could the Pacific and its island nations be in such a conflict?
It's the geography of Pacific countries that is key here. So the Pacific territories, their exclusive economic zones, lie between the US and China. They provide access to the South China Sea, up to Taiwan as well. So it's really about the US and Australia seeking to increase confidence in their expectation that Pacific countries would allow military assets to travel through their territories in the event of a conflict. It's in this context that security deals become perhaps more important than they have been in recent times. And one example of that is, of course, the US Defense Cooperation Agreement with Papua New Guinea that was signed earlier this year. Again, the intent there is not that Papua New Guinea would necessarily contribute material or personnel to any defense contingency, but rather that it would allow the US to position supplies, to transit through its region, and so on.
President Biden has made the Indo-Pacific a huge strategic focus, and he says this is to counter Chinese influence. But in a recent budget request to Congress of 100 billion US dollars, just 2% of that was earmarked for the Indo-Pacific. With the war in Ukraine and now the conflict between Israel and Hamas, is there a danger that the US might be caught off guard in the Pacific?
I think the first thing to say is that there is no guarantee against strategic surprise. And Hamas's action recently against Israel is the latest demonstration of that, but history is littered with such examples. The other thing I say is the context is important in that the bulk of that funding that President Biden is looking to unlock is to contribute to mobilizing military assets and personnel to live conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza. But it doesn't represent the totality of the US's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So the US's strategy more broadly in the Indo-Pacific for pushing back against China and for deterring against Chinese potential military expansion relies on diplomacy, on economic ties, on development ties. It sort of sits outside that envelope, if you will, and it's multifaceted strategy. So I think it's important to contextualize it in that way.
And as the US tries to build partnerships with individual island nations, is it doing enough? Because, for instance, after the Solomon Islands signed an agreement with China, then the US reopened its embassy there, which had been closed for 30 years. But initially, at least, it will only have 2 American diplomats. So is it sending the right message? Is it doing enough to counter Chinese influence, do you think?
I think by itself, the US couldn't possibly do enough to counter China's influence in the Pacific or in other regions in the world. The US relies on its partnerships. It relies on the alliances that it's built since World War II. It's seeking to strengthen them where it can, and it relies on finding new partners, as it's doing with Philippines, with Papua New Guinea, and it's working very closely with countries like Australia, closer to our region in the South Pacific. But ultimately, this alliance system very much relies on those countries where this competition is playing out. So the US can't be all things to everyone. It needs to work together with like-minded countries like Australia. But even so, countries like Australia and the US need to build these genuine and lasting relationships with countries in the Pacific. So it's an ongoing effort, and it's a contested space.
And how do you see this power play between China on one side, the US and Australia on the other, and all the other countries now showing increasing interest in the Pacific playing out over the coming years?
I think one narrative that is emerging very strongly from Pacific countries, if I could focus on that region, is that although Pacific countries value their relationships with traditional partners like the US and Australia and so on, they do get something new out of their relationship with China, something vital to their own interests, and it is that income, that economic access. So it's an opportunity for traditional partners to reevaluate the nature of their relationships with Pacific countries, to offer them a better deal, if you will, and to make the global South overall feel more included in the international rules-based system, so that the perception isn't that it only benefits those countries at the helm, like the US, but actually provides security, stability, and prosperity at a global scale. So I do think that the status quo up to now hasn't been good enough, and it's an opportunity to do better.
And it's something that the eyes of the world will be following. We'll be watching this as well, this important region. Thank you so much for joining us, Mihai, and sharing your insights and analysis.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus, do follow us on social media. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.